All right, buckle up, because wow, you really weren't messing around with this reading list. We're diving headfirst into arguably one of the most analyzed presidencies ever, Donald Trump. But, and this is key, we're ditching the surface level headlines and going deep, like really deep.
Right. It's easy to get stuck in that daily drama loop, but we're after something more significant.
Exactly. We're talking lasting impact, societal shifts, political tremors, the whole shebang. And thankfully, we've got some seriously insightful research to guide us.
I'm all for insightful, especially with a figure as, shall we say, multifaceted as Trump. Where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, one of the papers, The Effects of Donald Trump, has this really neat framework, and honestly, it kind of blew my mind.
Oh, lay it on me. What's the magic lens this time?
They call it a layered approach.
Layered, huh? Sounds almost too delicious for serious analysis.
Right. My first thought was cake, but trust me, it's way more insightful than a sugar rush. Picture this. You've got these distinct layers, and each one interacts with the others. At the very base, you have societal structures. You know, those deep-seated anxieties, beliefs, the invisible threads that kind of hold everything together.
Okay, I'm following. So like the bedrock, the foundation on which everything else is built.
Exactly. Then, on top of that, you have the layer of political institutions. Congress, the courts, the media, all those gears of power.
Right. They all keep things moving, or, well, sometimes they throw a wrench in the works.
And finally, at the very top, you've got the policies themselves. You know, those concrete changes that directly impact people's lives.
Okay, I'm liking this visual. So we've got the foundation, the machinery, and then the actual output, the stuff that hits the ground.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. This study doesn't just stop at describing these layers. It also categorizes the types of changes a leader can set in motion. They talk about accelerants, things that intensify already existing trends.
So like a catalyst, something that amplifies what's already there.
Precisely. Then there are breaks, like sudden swerves away from the established path. We've also got reversals, where progress gets, well, reversed.
Oh, I know that one all too well. It's like taking 2 steps forward and then getting yanked 3 steps back.
Right. Then we've got consolidation, which is essentially doubling down on the status quo. And then, of course, the infamous no effect.
Because sometimes, no matter how hard you shake things up, nothing really changes.
Exactly. So instead of just listing what Trump did, this layered approach allows us to analyze how those actions reverberated through each level, like a chain reaction.
Like dominoes, one toppling into the next. Okay, I'm sold. So let's talk dominoes. Where do we see this layered impact most clearly?
Well, a lot of the sources, like The Effects of Donald Trump and The Ecstatic Edge of Politics, point to Trump acting as an accelerant, particularly when it comes to those societal anxieties we were talking about. Like, he didn't invent these anxieties, but he sure knew how to exploit them.
Right, it's that whole idea of tapping into existing fault lines, pouring gasoline on an already smoldering fire.
Exactly. So let's talk about those anxieties. The white working class, for example, that's a group that comes up a lot in the research. Their anxieties about economic insecurity, cultural change, those weren't just figments of Trump's imagination.
Absolutely not. Those anxieties were very real, and they were already simmering long before Trump arrived on the scene.
So it was less about him creating these anxieties and more about him weaponizing them for political gain.
The ecstatic edge of politics really dives into this, and they argue that's exactly what happened. Trump offered a narrative where those anxieties were validated, where those who felt left behind finally felt seen and heard.
It's that whole idea of make America great again, like this implicit promise to return to a time when they felt more secure, more valued.
Precisely. He gave them a villain, the political elite, the media, anyone he deemed an enemy, and positioned himself as their champion, their savior. And that kind of narrative, that emotional appeal, can be incredibly powerful.
Speaking of emotional appeals, we have to talk about the role of fear, anger, and even resentment in Trump's rise to power. Because it wasn't just about policy, right? It was about tapping into those raw emotions.
Oh, absolutely. The ecstatic edge of politics and Women for Trump are particularly insightful on this. They argued that Trump understood the power of those primal emotions better than almost any politician in recent history, and he wasn't afraid to exploit them.
Which, when you think about it, is a pretty dangerous game. Because once those emotions are unleashed, they can be very difficult to control.
Well, it's like opening Pandora's box, isn't it? You never know what's going to come out.
And that leads us directly to the next layer, the impact on political institutions.
Right.
Because this is where we really start to see the consequences of those unleashed emotions and that divisive rhetoric.
Right, because it's one thing to tap into societal anxieties, but it's another thing entirely to then turn those anxieties against the very institutions meant to safeguard democracy. And that's where things get really dicey.
Okay, so we've seen how Trump acted as an accelerant on those existing anxieties and how his rhetoric, shall we say, impacted those democratic institutions. But what about the top layer, the actual policy changes? Did his actions always match his, let's call it colorful rhetoric?
Now that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources we've got here paint a bit of a mixed picture. In some areas, there were undeniable shifts. In others, well, not so much.
It's almost like the art of the deal didn't always translate to governing, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it was a no deal, sometimes more of the same old deal.
Precisely. Take healthcare, for instance. Remember repeal and replace? That was like the anthem of his campaign. But the effects of Donald Trump points out, for all the talk, healthcare policy didn't actually change that much.
Huh. You'd think something he campaigned so hard on would see more action. Was it a matter of, like even with the Republican Congress for part of it, he just couldn't get everyone on board?
That's a big part of it. It really highlights how, even with the most bombastic rhetoric, presidential power has limits. Sure, Trump chipped away at the edges of the Affordable Care Act, executive orders here, regulatory changes there, but that full-blown repeal never materialized. Turns out dismantling a system that complex, way easier said than done.
So healthcare, a prime example of no effect, even with all the noise around it. But then you've got immigration, another signature issue where his words were matched with some pretty major moves.
And immigration is a perfect example of how all those layers we talked about, they really collide. Because, yeah, the wall wasn't built, not really, but remember those images, kids separated from their parents at the border? That was the direct result of Trump's zero-tolerance policy. Not goes at all. Really lays out the timeline on that one.
Hard to forget those images. I mean, the outrage was palpable, and not just here in the U.S.
Exactly. And that speaks to those anxieties we talked about, right? The fear, the sense of cultural change happening too fast. Trump tapped right into that, creating a climate where a policy like zero tolerance, as harsh as it was, could actually gain traction.
And even though, like you said, the wall wasn't built, the effects of Donald Trump mentions there was already a lot of fencing. So it was almost like the wall itself became this symbol, even if the physical reality wasn't that different.
Oh, the symbolism was everything. And it wasn't just the wall. Don't forget about the travel bans. Several Muslim-majority countries, citizens basically barred. Not goes at all. Goes deep on the fallout from that. Legally, socially, you name it.
Right, because that sparked accusations of discrimination, even went to the Supreme Court, if I remember right.
It did. And it really fueled this surge in anti-Muslim sentiment, which, again, ties back to those anxieties Trump was so good at stoking.
Okay, so with immigration, we're seeing this blend of symbolic gestures, actual policy changes, executive orders flying left and right. It's impactful, no doubt, even if some of the big ideas, like that wall, never quite materialized. But let's shift gears to something that did get done. Those tax cuts. That was a major win for Trump, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, that was a genuine legislative victory for the Trump administration. Simplified the tax code, at least on paper, reduced taxes, big time, for corporations and individuals, too. They touted it as this huge boost to the economy.
Right, but I remember at the time there were critiques saying the cuts really only benefited the wealthy, that it actually made income inequality worse. Is that something the research backs up?
It does. The effects of Donald Trump argues that while, yeah, the tax cuts achieved some of their stated aims, they also, and this is their wording, reinforced existing trends toward greater income inequality. Basically, those at the top saw the biggest gains, which you could argue just deepens the divide, right?
Right, like rather than leveling the playing field, it tilted even further in one direction.
Exactly. The study refers to this as consolidation, which basically means those in power, they just solidify their position.
So legislative win, sure, but its impact on something like economic equality, that's definitely up for debate. Before we jump away from policy altogether, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the whole erosion of trust thing, not just in Trump himself, but in institutions in general. And 2021 577350001.pdf talks about this, how that decline in trust in the U.S., it's been decades in the making. That feels like a big deal, like one of those lingering impacts, regardless of specific policies.
Oh, 100%. And this goes way beyond Trump himself. It's this broader trend, this decline in trust across the board. Government, media, even science. People are disillusioned, man.
It's like that saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. It's like folks have been fooled so many times they've just stopped trusting anyone in a position of authority.
perfect analogy. And what's crazy is this isn't just an American thing, it's global. People everywhere are feeling increasingly disconnected from the systems that are supposed to serve them. Not exactly a recipe for a stable world, is it?
And Trump's style, the constant attacks on the media, that whole fake news thing, that just threw gasoline on that fire, didn't it?
No doubt. By constantly chipping away at the credibility of the media, of experts, of anyone who disagreed with him, he created this environment where facts became fluid. Suddenly, it was easy to dismiss any information you didn't like as fake news, which just deepens that distrust, you know?
It's like he hacked the system, using those very freedoms, like speech and the press, as weapons against the institutions they're meant to protect.
It's kind of brilliant and terrifying all at the same time, isn't it? And it raises all sorts of questions about the future of democracy, especially in this digital age. But for now, let's shift gears from the domestic to the international, because all of this, it didn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Right. Those ripple effects, they go way beyond American borders.
Mm.
So how did Trump's whole America First approach, how did that land on the global stage? What was the rest of the world thinking? All right, so we've scaled the societal anxiety mountain, navigated the halls of power, and even rummaged through the policy toolbox, all through the lens of Trump's America. And we even touched on how his America First slogan echoed across the globe. Phew. Now for the big question, the one we've been building toward. What do we learn from all of this?
Ah, the million-dollar question. Because history, it's not just about looking back. It's about how those echoes from the past shape where we are now, and, maybe more importantly, where we go from here.
Exactly. And with someone like Trump, someone who, let's face it, kind of blew up the norms, those lessons feel even more, I don't know, urgent,
Yeah.
essential.
Absolutely. So let me ask you, what's the biggest takeaway for you? What's that one thought, that one thread that's going to stick with you long after this deep dive is over?
Honestly, it's the power of narratives. And we've touched on it throughout this whole thing, right? How Trump tapped into those very real anxieties, that sense of like cultural displacement, folks feeling left behind. But it was a story he told, the way he framed those anxieties that really struck me.
He offered a narrative where those grievances weren't just heard, they were validated. Like, the ecstatic edge of politics said, it was a compelling narrative of restoration, make America great again. That wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise to return to a time when those anxieties didn't exist, or at least weren't as potent.
He gave them a target for their anger, too, right? The enemy, whether it was the media, the elites, whoever. And in his narrative, he was the hero, the one fighting for them.
Powerful stuff. Because when someone comes along and tells your story, it validates your experiences, it creates this intense emotional bond, one that goes beyond those usual political labels.
And it makes you think about misinformation, propaganda, that whole beast. Because if people are already primed to believe a certain story, it's that much easier to feed them distorted facts, even outright lies, and have it stick.
Oh, absolutely. And that was a constant throughout the Trump years. Attacking the media, fake news this, fake news that, embracing any conspiracy theory that fit the narrative, even if it meant contradicting himself the next day. It created this hall of mirrors where truth was whatever was convenient at that moment.
And Narcos at all didn't let him off the hook for that. They really highlighted how those attacks on the media, those weren't just words. They had real-world consequences, created this climate where journalists were harassed, threatened, even attacked.
Because at the end of the day, a free press, one that can hold truth to power, that's the cornerstone of a functioning democracy. Chip away at that, and the whole structure starts to crumble.
And it's not just the traditional media anymore, right? Social media, algorithms, echo chambers, all of that just throws gasoline on the fire. People are more connected than ever, yet also more siloed, fed a steady diet of information that confirms what they already believe.
It's a paradox, isn't it? More information, but also more fertile ground for misinformation. So how do we combat that? Where do we even begin to untangle that mess?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And honestly, I don't think there's any easy answer. But I do think a big part of it is education. We've got to equip people to be critical thinkers, to evaluate sources, spot bias, and those basic media literacy skills.
Because it's not about telling people what to think. It's about giving them the tools to think for themselves.
And maybe, just maybe, it also requires some of that healing, that bridging of divides. Remember we talked about 2021-577-35001.pdf and their idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Usually that's talked about in the context of racial injustice, which is, of course, incredibly important. But what if we broaden that out? What if we had a national conversation, a genuine attempt to acknowledge those deeper wounds that Trump so effectively exploited?
It's a long shot, I'll grant you that. But there's something really powerful about that imagery, you know? Truth and reconciliation. Because without both, without a shared understanding of the past and a genuine attempt to heal those divisions, well, it's hard to move forward as a society.
It does feel like we're at this crossroads. The Trump years, they showed us the cracks in our foundation, how fragile things really are. But they also sparked this, I don't know, this surge of civic engagement, this renewed passion for those democratic ideals that we maybe took for granted.
And that's what gives me hope. Because democracy, it's not a spectator sport, right? It
Mhm.
requires us to show up, to stay informed, to hold our leaders accountable, to never, ever stop questioning and engaging.
Beautifully said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Trump era, I think that's what we need to hold on to, that hope, that belief that we, as informed, engaged citizens, have the power to shape a better future. We've explored the dark side, sure, but we've also glimpsed the potential for positive change. It's up to all of us to make sure those lessons aren't forgotten. Thanks for joining us, everyone.